Haunted Ohio, Volume 1, by Chris Woodyard. The Happy Haunting Grounds. The Haunted Skull and Other Native American Hauntings. A hunter of shadows, himself a shade. The 100th Tongue. The ugliest man who ever lived is said to roam Mochkin State Park searching for a gruesome trophy. This Indian warrior, called Tom Leon's by settlers, wore a necklace of 99 dried human tongues strung on a strand of human sinew. He vowed that he would kill his 100th white man and add his tongue to the string. Before he could fulfill his vow, Lyons was killed on the stagecoach road and his body thrown into Killbuck Swamp. Now he stalks the picturesque paths of the Mochkin State Park with his ghostly axe at the ready for his 100th victim. Native Americans and the Life Beyond. Native Americans have always been supposed to live closer to nature and to phenomenon that the earthly settlers found inexplicable. The Indian could track game almost by scent. He could see in the dark and detect the invisible signs of a prey's passage. He seemed to possess some unique psychic faculty that had decayed in his more civilized brethren. Native American shamans originated phenomena later imitated by the 19th century rapping mediums. The Great Spirit manifested his power in a shaking sweat lodge, the origin of the shaking spirit cabinet of Athens County medium Jonan Koons. Within a short time, Indian spirit guides like Bluebird and Red Eagle, and one who claimed the unlikely name of Chlorine, were materialized in seance rooms across the county. Among the Shawnee, one of the largest tribes in Ohio, the dead were referred to as Ashanwa, vanished or disappeared, and were believed to return to prey on the living if ghost feasts were not held to honor them. A ghost feast, the spirits were invited to partake in food and drink. If a ghost had been seen recently, the makers of the feast might respectfully ask it to not bother the living. Then all the fires and lights were put out and the food was left for the spirits, who took only the essence or the spirit of the food, although sometimes a drinking cup would be found mysteriously emptied after the feast. The Ravenous Dead. The Chippewa also believed that the dead needed to be appropriated by offerings of food, as illustrated by this tale from southeastern Ohio of the two Jebiug. There was a hunter who lived with his wife in an isolated lodge near the Pennsylvania border. One winter's evening, he did not return at his usual time, and his wife feared that he had had an accident. When at last she heard the sound of footsteps, she opened the door, thinking to see her husband. Instead, two stranger women stood outside. Politely, she invited them in, although their looks made her uneasy. They were stick-thin and pale as maggots. Their eyes were sunken deep into their skulls, starved birds looking out of holes. The women refused to sit the visitor's seat by the fire, but huddled far away in a chilly corner of the lodge. They hid their faces in their robes, and they did not speak. Fires flickered eerily as a gust of wind swept through the lodge. "The Great Spirit, have pity," moaned a voice. "The dead walk clothed like the living." At this the women trembled and would have fled, but as she opened the lodge door, her husband stood there, laden with a large deer. Instantly the two strangers cried, "What a fine, fat animal!" and running to it, they pulled off the choicest parts and gulped them down greedily. The hunter and his wife were amazed, but being polite hosts, they said nothing, for the women looked as though they were starving. The next day the hunter returned with another fine deer. This the stranger also tore to pieces and ate ravenously. On the third day the hunter, wishing to be a good host, bundled up all the fattiest parts and placed them before the women. They bolted the chosen morsels, then, still unsatisfied, they attacked the wife's portion and polished it off. Husband and wife were astonished at such manners, but again they said nothing. For many months the strange women stayed at the lodge, sitting silently in their corner during the day, creeping out at night to gather firewood. If they needed a tool or an eating utensil, they always returned it precisely to the spot where they found it. They never spoke again, and they never laughed. The winter was nearly over when one evening the hunter returned with another fine deer. He laid it before his wife, but the two women plunged in front of her and tore off the fat so voraciously that the wife grew angry. She restrained herself, however, and only quietly remarked that her guest seemed hungry. At this the two women looked stunned and withdrew to their corner. The hunter tried to question them as to what was wrong, but they would not speak. That night the hunter was awakened by the sobs that came from the two women. Deeply upset, he said, "Tell me what has caused your sorrow. Has my wife been inhospitable or rude?" Weeping, they shook their heads, and at last they spoke. "You have treated us with every kindness, but now we must depart. We came from the land of the dead to test the living. Often we have heard the bereaved say, 'If only my loved ones could come back to me, I would give my life to making them happy.' And the Master of life and death sent us to see if mankind really meant this. If the living proved sincere to their desires to pleasure the dead, then he who has the power over death would restore the departed ones to life. We were set to see your tempers with our outrageous behavior, but now the dead will never return." The two women sobbed bitterly, and the lodge was plunged into a darkness like the grave. The hunter and his wife heard the door open and shut. When light returned, the two women were gone forever, to the land from which no one returns. The Death Lights of New Philadelphia. In Tuscarawas County, in the 1770s, a Mingo chief married a white woman settler. They were both Christians and decided to attend a mission at the Skolburn, led by missionary David Zeisberg. At this meeting, the chief met a bunch of younger Indian women who threw themselves at him. Flattered, the chief responded favorably and eloped with the young women. But the chief's wife was maddened by jealousy, and she followed the lovers to New Philadelphia, where she pursued them up a high ridge by the Tuscarawas River. With a howl of fury, she flung herself at her husband, who was taken by surprise and tumbled backwards off the cliff. The younger woman screamed as the wife attacked her. Desperately, she grappled with the women, but the wife was too strong for her and pushed her off the cliff's edge. She clawed a bit, then feeling herself falling, clutched at her attacker. Together, They went over the edge into the river below. The broken bodies were carried back to Schulburn, but Reverend Zeisberg, appalled by the scandal, refused them Christian burial. Ever since that day, 3 lights, 2 red and 1 white, swirled at the edge of the steep cliff at Stone Quarry, until they fall and are extinguished by the river. The Haunted Indian Skull. Many Native American tribes object very strongly to the desecration of their ancestors' remains. In Xenia, as a long-dead Indian took matters into his own head. Steve Hale, forensic sculptor, is a man with 1,000 faces, all of them built on the faceless remains of the anonymous dead. He tries, using clay and paint, wigs and glass eyes, to bring the dead back to life, to give each of them a name and a past, so they may go to their graves in peace. His story began in the fall of 1987, when a cow rubbed up against a sandy bank in a stone quarry near Village Spring. A skull popped out of the hillside, rolled down the bank, and was found by the farmer Ed Gordon, who called the sheriff. The sheriff called the coroner's office. Steve Hale took the call. Hale was instantly interested. Bones are a business. As a forensic sculptor and criminal investigator for the prosecutor's office, he handles thousands of human remains every year. Grinning skulls hold no terror for him. Instead, they fascinate him with the stories they have to tell. The muscle twisted just so across the cheek, a large nose, heavy brow bones, they make the naked skull as individual as the person who once inhabited it. Calling in Dr. Ann Bellasara? Calling in Dr. Anna Bellasara of Wright State University's Sociology and Anthropology Department, Hale went to the scene with camera and excavating equipment. I wanted to treat it like a homicide, which is what you do until you know what you have. With Dr. Bellasara's help, he excavated a nearly complete skeleton of a male. He was buried in a ceremonial fashion, arms down at his side, face up, head straight. He was also buried under a very large tree on top of a hill, which was a favorite site for Native American burials. It was also a good site from Hale's point of view. The sandy soil has preserved the bones beautifully. After examining the teeth of the skull, they both agreed that the skeleton was probably that of a Native American of an unknown date. Bellasara advised him to put the remains back in the ground, since the Native American tribes in this area have concerns about the reburial of their ancestors' remains. I had nightmares of this getting into the newspapers, she says. Just leave them, I told him. And she left the scene. Hale had a different idea. I wanted the bones to myself, to study them. I asked him about his feelings about studying other people's relatives' remains. He laughed. I'd dig up my own grandfather if I thought I could learn something from it. I don't have any problem with it. So, getting Gordon's permissions, he personally collected all of the bones and put them in a box. The bones were in perfect condition, absolutely pristine. They were very strong, which is unusual in bones of this age. But because of his investigative background and his inquisitive nature, Hale wanted to know more about them. The bones were from a man in his 30s. There was no trauma and no known cause of death. I wanted something more definitive. He got something definitive, but definitely more than he had bargained for. Within 2 weeks of the excavation, Hale had moved out of his home and began divorce proceedings against his wife. Within a month, he had been forced from his job at the coroner's office under very unpleasant circumstances. Unhappy at as the time was, he didn't associate any of it with the boxed skeleton in the storage area of his apartment, or with the skull he kept on his apartment work table. He was fascinated by the perfectly preserved skull. He wanted to learn everything he could about the skull and the man. The face held some surprises. It was a softer face than I would have expected. I guess I expected some big, brawny kind of face. The guy had a real ski slope nose like Bob Hope. He had a typical bite like a Mongolian. He was missing his first 4 upper incisors. I made him some. He was in his final days at the coroner's office when a woman artist asked if she could borrow the skull for a research project she was doing for a museum on facial characteristics of ancient Indians. Within a week, she brought the skull back abruptly, abandoning it in a box on his desk with a terse note, "I'm returning this to you. Call me." Hale called, and she spilled all of her fears and accidents of the past few weeks. She started telling me about all this bad luck she's had. The chain on her bicycle came off, and it flew up and cut her eye. And then her back went out of place, and 2 or 3 other horrendous things. That was the beginning of the story of the cursed skull. She believed her misfortunes began when she picked up the skull and decided she'd better bring it back, fast. Intrigued, Hale had his friend, Pennsylvania psychic Carol Kirkpatrick, look at the skull. She held it. She told me about who he was. She said he was a half-Native American who had been friendly to the settlers. He died in 1790 from a brain inflammation. She described what he looked like, including an amulet he wore around his neck. She said he didn't mind being studied by me, but he was becoming restless that his remains were still disinterred. Not only did Kirkpatrick tell Hale that the skull's owner was unhappy, she herself became a target of the skull's wrath. The fall after she talked with Hale, he sent her a sketch of a photo he'd taken of her holding the skull. She proudly displayed the drawing in her living room. The result? There was turmoil in the house, declared Kirkpatrick. The whole household was on edge. The picture was kept in the room where she gives her psychic readings. If the picture was in sight when I was doing a reading, everything would be upset. There was a lot of confusion. Everything bothered everyone. It was like the energy was scraping everybody's nerves. My husband even threatened to divorce me. Kirkpatrick feels strongly that the Native American was upset that he was on display. He didn't mind being studied, but now he wanted to be in private. She slid the picture out of sight behind another picture in a frame, and there was peace again. But whenever she tried to display the picture, the same emotional reactions occurred. Now she keeps the sketch permanently covered. Anthropologist Belisari disagrees with Kirkpatrick's dating of the skull. The bones were definitely prehistoric, probably 5,000 years old. The farmer who owned the property had found other prehistoric objects. No matter what the date of the skull, Hale still didn't make the connection. I just didn't give the whole idea much thought. It took a long time to realize that there was something to it, something beyond the normal. Criminal investigators are trained to be skeptical, but from childhood, Hale believed in things that go bump in the night. His home in West Liberty was supposedly haunted by the former owner's ghost. It was a lavish house built by this millionaire, 3-car garage, a swimming pool, and everything. The millionaire died in the kitchen in the 1920s, so the story went. We'd hear things at night, and it wasn't just the old steam heat system. It was doors slamming and footsteps walking upstairs. I'd be in the house and think one of my brothers had come in and find out they were all waiting for me outside in the car. Even the dog was spooked by the house, so I believed in ghosts. It wasn't that I disbelieved in the skull, but until I started thinking about what was happening to me, I didn't think anything of it. And I didn't want to believe because I wanted to keep the skull. But then I went through these dramatic changes. I got divorced and I lost my job under bad circumstances. It was the first time in my adult life I had no job and I was kind of lost. Shortly after, I decided that we needed to get this guy back in the ground. Hale boxed up the skull with the skeleton and called Ed Gordon. I asked him to rebury the skeleton in an undisclosed location. Bury him, and don't tell me where, I told him. Just bury him facing east because the psychic said he wants to be buried that way. Gordon and his wife came down to the office and got the box of bones, and then they kind of walked off into the sunset with him. And has his luck changed since then? Hale thought back. I had the skull about a year. Much of the year I was either out of work or working a really awful job with the detective agency. It was right after I made the decision to rebury him that the prosecuting attorney picked me up in the fall of 1988. I was even at the prosecutor's office when Gordon picked up the bones. And since then, I'd done some real interesting things. I teach at Northwestern University. I've developed a unique kids ID program for missing children. I'd say things are definitely better. Hill tried to explain his ambivalence about the skull. I had always felt the presence of a real person, because I had reconstructed his face and seen what he had looked like. Much as I loved the skull and I wanted to keep it, it was still quite eerie to look at. He struggled for the right word to describe his feelings. Not morbidity in the normal sense, like people are afraid of skulls. It looked quite, I don't know how to say it. I don't want to say evil, but ominous. Has he felt any ending to the story of the haunted skull? Hopefully he's at rest now. On the day he was buried, I saw the biggest hawk I'd ever seen on a tree by Route 35, just east of Valley Road. I stopped and watched him. He was huge, big as an eagle. He was watching another hawk in the road who had been killed. Suddenly he took off and flew majestically away. Never seen one that big since.